Fine. Well, let's talk about something going on in Scotland, where I mean the SNP leadership may be quite happy, as we know, under their laws to lock you and me up for saying outrageously offensive and terrible criminal things like that a trans woman is not a woman, a trans woman is a man, and that men can't become women. And we also don't want them in our prison cells should we end up in prison, even though that's still the case in Scotland. I believe there are still 2 men in England who are in women's prison cells. There's a court case involving one at the current time where she's the one who's being tried for apparently, not abusing him by the fact she won't use his pronouns. Just extraordinary situation. But latest madness from the SNP. Scotland's First Minister John Swinney, he has backed the rights of trans people who self-identify to use women's toilets and changing rooms. So he's basically saying men who identify as trans, who simply say, I believe I'm a woman this Thursday afternoon, should be allowed to enter our hard-won, legally protected single-sex spaces. What do you make of this?
It's absolutely shocking that John Swinney can be such a numpty. The SNP are utter mad. I mean, they've lost a leader over this. They've practically destroyed Scottish nationalism. They're so discredited around the issue of self-ID in relation to gender. But this is in the context of the heroic fight by Nurse Peggie to simply get change. And nurses have to get change all the time, don't they? That's the nature of the job. And Nurse Peggie says, I don't want to share my changing room with a doctor who is male, biologically male, but identifies as a woman. And there's now a big employment tribunal. And can you consider this? These are progressives, allegedly, right, in the SNP. And they are the ones who would say, we must protect women from all potential violence at any given time. These are the ones who will say, health workers, nurses are heroic, and you're not allowed to criticise them even when sometimes criticism is due. But oh no, in this instance, they have sided with a doctor who, by the way, doesn't need to get changed as it goes, but entering into a female space and getting changed, or more appropriately, while that nurse is getting changed, a male is there to look.
Well, and she said he repeatedly stared at her as well. So, I mean, very intimidating.
Exactly. It's all a bit dodgy before you get there. But as a point of principle, the public in Scotland are outraged by this, and they assume that we'll all support the nurse. But the SNP can't bring themselves but to repeat and repeat ad nauseum the ideology of trans ideology that refuses to acknowledge women's rights in this space. One thing I would like to say, because I think it is important, that I'm delighted that Labour representatives in the Scottish Parliament have now said we made a terrible mistake when we introduced gender self-ID in the Scottish Parliament. I love a mea culpa like everyone, but let's pretend that they weren't well informed at the time when Labour led the charge in terms of demonising anybody who argued against this. They refused to take evidence from women's rights organisations like For Women Scotland, like Sex Matters and LGBT Alliance and so on. They refused all that. In fact, they went along with demonising them as bigots. So I'm delighted Labour have entered the fold and now say we made a mistake. But they should now, if they really mean that, be absolutely ardent campaigners the other way and absolutely humiliate the SNP.
That's the thing, is I don't believe any of them really believe that a man can become a woman or the so-called identify. We say trans woman, let's use the correct term, a trans-identifying man. Let's stop using the phrase trans women, because that's what confuses people. I don't believe they really believe they become women. The people just pretend this because they virtue signal at their North London dinner parties or their their Edinburgh dinner parties, I don't know. But bearing in mind that Labour is still led by a man who currently in Washington who claims to believe that 0.1% of women in this country do have a penis. I mean, there is an insanity here, and until that is ended, people have to say, no, that's wrong, I don't believe that, I was wrong to say that. I still can't take these people seriously. What did you make of, Donald Trump? He's got a lot of faults. My God, I'm critical of him over Ukraine and many other things, but he's been an absolute joy to watch over things like women's sport, women's safe spaces. Your passport has to say male or female. That's it. End of discussion. You're one or the other, and it's what you biologically are, not what you claim to be on a Thursday afternoon. This is bringing sanity back. How hopeful are you that we're always downstream of American cultural change? Do you think that will bring some sanity here, or are they going to double down?
So I think the thing to note is that it's very disconcerting when Donald Trump, not a man I admire hugely on a range of things, when he was bringing out those executive orders, I mean, I was literally kind of fist pumping and cheering, protecting women's sports. And you think it's got so ludicrous that we're in a country that we look on enviously as someone stating the absolute bleeding obvious, which is we know what the difference between a woman is and a man is, and we're going to protect women's rights. And the fact that you can't safely say that the UK Labour Party, who run the country, would guarantee those rights, or that in Scotland we have a leadership that won't, or indeed in Wales, etc. And that this is, by the way, institutionally in every nook and cranny. So to answer your question, that is the problem. The problem is, unless there is an absolute determined attempt at a kind of Doge-like or executive order-like intervention by our political leaders or by our political elite, the problem is that institutionally the NHS, the civil service, the education system is actually embraced this and has brought it into their own rulemaking. So we need far more clarity. I think it's incredible, by the way, that the Equalities and Human Rights Commission actually went to Scotland to explain to this John Swinney what the law was on this, and they still said, oh yes, but I have to say that a trans woman is a woman because otherwise I'll fall out with my hardcore supporters. They are incapable of understanding the popular support for this, which is why, by the way, Donald Trump, for all his faults, gained millions and millions of votes of ordinary working people, particularly working women, who said, at least I know that they will protect our children from sharing, facilities with our little girls with boys and our female athletes with men. And actually, that alone was enough to get him a huge swathe of support.
Absolutely. And I've always said in my, for elections here, this is a deal breaker for me. You're either sane or you're not. It's as simple as that. Baroness Claire Fox, always a voice of sanity and common sense, independent peer and director of the Academy of Ideas. Thank you very much indeed.